For more than 2,000 years, the Great Pyramids have spawned a countless amount of debates over who built them, what their purpose was, and why. Traditionally, it's accepted that these great megalithic colossal heaps of stone that are perfectly aligned to true north and south were originally intended to be the eternal resting place of ancient Egypt's great god kings. A tomb meant to forever protect the pharaoh's body as well as the treasures that he will take with him into the next life. But seeing as history has unfortunately lent us no definitive archaeological evidence of who was really buried in these pyramids, as well as no hieroglyphs within these pyramids or the surrounding mortuary temples, we're left with a bit of ambiguity. And this ambiguity spawns a countless amount of contemporary theories regarding the pyramid's purpose, spanning to anything from just being a tomb to being a ram water pump or even the vessel that holds the lost Ark of the Covenant. At the very least, even if the pyramids were built to entomb the sacred body of the pharaoh, the various labyrinths, chambers, and tunnels that align to astronomical bodies in the sky indicate that the pyramids were definitely much more than just tombs. But that's not really what this video is about. Of all the mysteries surrounding the Great Pyramid that are still discussed and highly debated thousands of years later, one that I think is often overlooked is what happened to the Great Pyramid's capstone. Today, there are no pyramids in Egypt still currently upholding a capstone. And of the up to around 138 pyramids that have been found throughout Egypt, we only have about 5 capstones still intact, or at least they were found broken and put back together. These are called pyramidions. So the very few capstones that we have to begin with, as well as you have to understand the pyramids as well as many sites and temples throughout ancient Egypt were quarried during the medieval times to build cities like Cairo. So this gives us an incomplete archaeological understanding as to the visual impact and perhaps symbolic impact that the capstones would have had sitting on top of the pyramids many thousands of years ago. Originally, the pyramids would have been cased in something called white Tura limestone, which was quarried about 15 miles up the Nile River south of Giza. Now, the simple fact that the Egyptians chose to use this Tura limestone rather than the local limestone tells us that by this period, at least in Egypt's Old Kingdom, the Egyptians were very well acquainted with different types of local stones. Now, Tura limestone compared to the local limestone found at Giza is a much more high quality and durable stone. And its density and fine grain also makes it more weather resistant and more capable of encasing and protecting the pyramid structure. Now, the Egyptians would have had access to any kind of stone that they wanted, but they chose this Tura limestone specifically for its high quality and for the visual effect that it would have had. Now, seeing as even the youngest given date for the Great Pyramid, which is somewhere around 2600 BC, is so deep into the remote past, we have very little idea what the visual purpose of choosing the Tura limestone would have been for the Egyptians. We cannot definitively say what visual purpose the Tura limestone was serving. In fact, in ancient times, the smooth, polished white surface of the pyramids would have reflected the sun's light all the way back down to the city of Memphis and could have been seen for anywhere from about 12 to 15 miles in any direction. And we can theorize that the choice of the Tura limestone allows the pyramids to be more visual from a distance and pop out from the horizon. And it's also thought that maybe the ancient Egyptians who were gazing up at the pyramids would have thought that it was some kind of spectacular white door opening up into the netherworld, opening up and leading to the sun in the outer world. Though this is all speculation, and all that we can do is look at the bits and fragments of remaining evidence and try to decipher and put together this puzzle and come out with some kind of meaning. Now, the reason highlighting the color of the Tura limestone that the Egyptians chose to case the pyramids in is important is because it may lend us some kind of clue as to what color and what type of stone the pyramid's capstone was made out of. Now, there are times in archaeology when it is and is not appropriate to look at the choices and actions of a later culture and then use those choices and actions to interpret what the same culture may have been doing thousands of years earlier. Here's a simple example. About 3,000 years ago, the Olmecs in Mexico and Central America were depicting what we would consider to be deformed and disabled people, and it looks like they were exalting and venerating these people and holding them at a high social class. Then in the year 1521, when the Spaniards came into contact with the Aztecs, as the Spaniards ascend up into Moctezuma's temple, they find that he is then living amongst people in his temple who he also exalts and venerates and holds at a high social status, people that we would interpret to be disabled or dysfunctional in some way. And we can potentially look at this and say, okay, this is something about the Mesoamerican world where they deem these people as having some kind of divine or special attribute, and they hold them in a high social class. And we can look at the behavior of the Aztecs and potentially use that to determine what the Olmecs were also thinking. In this same sense, we may be able to approach the pyramid of Amenemhat III in the same logic. The pyramid of Amenemhat III, known colloquially as the Black Pyramid, is extremely decayed. Now, it's thought that its decayed appearance results from the deficiencies within the construction that have allowed the pyramid to crumble over the course of the last 3,000 plus years. And because the pyramid was already beginning to slump, perhaps it looked like a prime quarrying site for medieval cultures living in the area to quarry up the blocks and take it to build new contemporary cities. And when all of its fine Tura limestone was quarried off to be built in the new cities, it left a crumbled black mess that we know today as the Black Pyramid. However, thousands of years ago, this would have been a glorious pyramid standing at around 250 feet tall, and the shine of the sun from its white Tura limestone would have been hard to stare at for too long. And it seems that from what architectural archaeologists and Egyptologists can gather from studying the site, it was actually a smaller copy of the Great Pyramid. So how does this help us figure out what happened to the Great Pyramid, or what the Great Pyramid's capstone looked like or was made out of? Well, if we can study younger generations of a certain culture and use their actions to interpret the actions of that same culture in the distant past, then we may be able to infer that it was the Great Pyramid that acted as the catalyst or the inspiration for Amenemhat III's black capstone. Now, a black capstone may or may not seem like a peculiar choice, but I actually think it makes sense that pharaohs and ancient architects would want the capstone to stand out from the rest of the pyramid. If you're standing from the bottom of the pyramid and you feel compelled to remove the top capstone of the pyramid, are you going to feel compelled by looking at an endless white Tura limestone from top to bottom? Or is there going to be something at the top of the pyramid that makes you feel compelled to remove it, something that catches your eye, something that visually contrasts itself from the rest of the pyramid? Wouldn't it stand out to you because it does stand out? Because it's a huge, shining black capstone on top of a solid white pyramid. The Great Pyramid is and has always been the jewel of ancient Egypt. Even the Greeks and Romans over 2,000 years ago were traveling all the way across the Mediterranean just to stand at its base. And even then, the Great Pyramid was older to the Greeks and the Romans than the Greeks and the Romans are to us. We have to think about every pharaoh from every dynasty gazing up at the pyramids for at least 2,500 years. All of these pharaohs with every bit of the authority to demand that the pyramids either be quarried or that the capstone be removed so that he can see it in front of him with his own eyes. And we have to think that at least several of these rulers were undoubtedly curious enough to do something like that. Not to mention all of the foreign rulers that would come later on, such as the Persians or the Greeks. And while maybe the Persians or the Greeks aren't prime candidates for people to remove the capstone, perhaps the Roman emperors later on certainly would be. Now, as far as we know, not every Roman emperor actually made his way across the Mediterranean to visit the land of pharaohs, but we can assume that it's possible that those who did stood at the base of the pyramid with every bit of the authority to pull down the capstone and said, you know what, bring that thing down here. I want to see it with my own eyes. I feel like over the course of over 3,000 years, somebody had enough curiosity to do that. And perhaps when the first person did it, Maybe he did it to all of the pyramids, or maybe he did it and he inspired other pharaohs or rulers or emperors to do the same. If the pyramid's capstones were highly polished granite or slate, or maybe even plated in gold, they surely would have reflected the sun and moonlight to some extent, maybe even being visible from extremely far away. One might even imagine some lowly Egyptian farmer tending to his barley and wheat fields nearby the pyramids, and he stops for a rest and he takes a gaze up at the pyramids, and as the sun is setting, the sun reflects off of the capstones and directly towards him. Perhaps he would have had a sense of wonder rush over him as he feels like the divine god king of an ancient past dynasty in Egypt actually saw him from the afterlife. The pyramids must have been full of wonder, myths, and legends that just haven't survived over the last several thousand years into the modern day. During the last 1,000 years of Egypt's reign, towards the end of the New Kingdom and certainly afterwards until the fall of Cleopatra, internal looting of Egypt's sacred burial sites became more and more common. At multiple points during these later dynasties, the Egyptian pharaohs and high priests of Amun had to send people out to recover the destroyed remains of pharaohs' bodies to be transported to other safe burial sites located elsewhere in Egypt, such as the Deir el-Balri cache created by Pinagem II, who was the high priest of Amun and basically pharaoh of Upper Egypt during the late New Kingdom sometime around 1000 BC. And as times became even more dire, pharaohs themselves began looting the tombs of other past pharaohs, such as Ptolemy X, who looted the solid gold sarcophagi of Alexander the Great and replaced it with some kind of crystal coffin sometime around the year 100 BC. So we have around 1,000 years of the Egyptians themselves internally looting their own burial sites. First, it began with grave robbers bribing the guards of these tombs. Then, over the course of 1,000 years, eventually it led to the pharaohs themselves looting the tombs. This decline in power and the increased need to loot the wealth of past pharaohs' tombs is really just a symptom of the greater Mediterranean area finally catching up to ancient Egypt's economy, because Egypt was so far ahead of the rest of the ancient world. It took several thousand years for all of the neighboring countries to finally catch up. You have to remember that by 2600 BC at least, Egypt's old kingdom was roaring, and hardly anything else outside of Mesopotamia was happening around the Mediterranean. The classical Greeks alone wouldn't emerge for nearly 2,000 more years, and the Trojan War wouldn't be for another at least 1,400 years. Ancient Egypt is incredibly old, and even at the youngest date of the Great Pyramids, they were still towering over the ancient world before the ancient world even began. All that to say, the capstones of the Great Pyramids were probably removed by an incredibly curious or an incredibly desperate pharaoh who thought that by somehow removing the capstone and bringing it down to the ground, he was doing something for either the betterment of himself or the betterment of Egypt as a whole. Now, it's possible that during the desecration of pagan sites during the Christian and Islamic eras of Egypt, the pyramidions, or the capstones at the top of the pyramids, were removed and destroyed, though at very great effort and expense, that's for sure. At many points throughout Egypt's history, they saw turbulent times. At multiple points lasting hundreds of years in total, the land of Egypt was divided among regional rulers known as nomarchs, who all feuded with each other over the control of Egypt's wealth and resources. And it's during this first initial intermediate phase, known as the First Intermediate Period, that the looting of Egypt's sites on a large scale by both its citizens and foreigners really began. There had always been local bandits paying off tomb guards and looting treasures, but nothing on a scale like this had ever been seen before. And these intermediate periods, where nothing was certain for the Egyptians living during this time, and nothing is certain from the archaeological record for us, happened 3 different times. I think it's possible that during these turbulent times and intermediate periods, when many significant artifacts were being destroyed and stolen, perhaps a pharaoh or some kind of regional ruler knew that it was up to them to preserve these capstones, and he brought them down and buried them with himself. We've never found fragments of these capstones anywhere else, and a capstone has never been discovered outside of Egypt. As far as we know, they were never taken as a souvenir for a wealthy Roman or Roman emperor. Nothing like that ever happened. I think it's possible that the capstone of the Great Pyramid may still be resting with an unknown, lesser important, obscure pharaoh or high priest of Amun who saved it during one of Egypt's many intermediate periods. I think that's possible. If you'd like to see Egypt's very few remaining capstones in person, then join me this January 2025, where we will be documenting them during our expedition. The Secrets of the Sands Egypt tour will involve us traveling for 2 weeks from Alexandria all the way down to Aswan, where we will see every single major Egyptian site. I'll leave a link to it in the description and the comment section below. If you'd like to learn more about ancient mysteries and ancient civilizations, well, I'm Luke Caverns. Please like and subscribe for more.